Okay, so this is our last review session. I'm kind of guessing this review session is going to be mostly um, people asking questions like, Mr. Barth, what is the cause of World War? We can talk about kind of big topics, or we can go over whatever you feel like is most troubling you or gets you tripped up the most. I'm only going to be able to meet for about half an hour, and then I have to pick up my kids from daycare. So we'll go till 3:30. So we can kind of talk about whatever you guys want to. I can see in the chat and I can hear too. So anyone in the room or on Zoom can ask for clarification on anything. So I can pretty much talk about whatever.
How do you like Vietnamization and escalation?
Yeah, so let's just go through the whole Vietnam War. About that. So when we look back before involvement in Vietnam War, we have things like Eisenhower, who was afraid that Vietnam might turn communist and lead the domino theory, that if one country turns to communism, other countries will too. And so we do send money to France as they're fighting against the communists, but eventually France has to leave and we take over. So that leads us to JFK. His policy for Vietnam is sending 16,000 military advisors. These are American soldiers who are basically advising anti-communist soldiers in Vietnam fighting against the communists. So 16,000, not that many. Eventually, he dies, and we have Johnson, who is going to see the event of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where supposedly an American ship is attacked. It leads to the Gulf of Tonkin, the resolution that basically allows Johnson to send soldiers into Vietnam, and this leads to escalation. That's his policy. So very quickly they come up with ways to get an army for this. So they have a draft. Okay, early on, you could avoid the draft by going to college. You could avoid the draft by some people would avoid the draft by purposely failing medical examinations. In some cases, people would join certain parts of the military that don't go overseas, like certain National Guard units or even the Coast Guard. Some cases, people would leave the country even. Okay, those are draft dodgers. And so the war is lasting out longer than Johnson would have hoped. It takes money away from the Great Society. And we're getting into years 3 and 4 of the war, and thousands of Americans are being killed. And really the turning point for the war is going to be the Tet Offensive, when Vietnamese soldiers, communists, attack Americans in this huge attack. Now, while it's a battlefield victory for the Americans, it becomes a loss back at home, because Americans are like, well, wait a minute, how could they do this huge offensive? I thought the war is almost over. President Johnson has been saying the war is almost over. The Vietnamese are going to surrender soon. It doesn't sound like the war is almost over. They must be lying. And so Johnson basically is losing his popularity. He decides not to run in 1968, and that's when Nixon runs. And Nixon's policy is Vietnamization. Vietnamization is where you pull American troops out of Vietnam. You give control and responsibility over to the South Vietnamese anti-communist forces, and we leave. Nixon is negotiating peace. With the Vietnamese, the communists. Eventually they decide to withdraw completely, and they leave in 1973. And so for all intents and purposes, that's the end of American involvement. The next president that comes after him, Ford, does try to send money and supplies to help South Vietnamese as the communists are taking over. But by that time, America is done with Vietnam. We don't send any stuff to them. And South Vietnam falls. Vietnam becomes united and is all communist. That's the war. Questions about the war or clarifications at all? Okay, other topics or things you want to talk about, either people in the room or people on the Zoom. Just watching the chat to see if anyone's going to put anything. If not, that's okay. I can just come up with things to talk about too. Yeah.
What's the antebellum?
Yeah, antebellum just means before the war. Traditionally, when people use the term antebellum, they're talking about like what's happening, like usually it's what's happening in the South during that time. That's usually what they're talking about. They might be talking about what's the situation of slavery, what's happening industrially in the South, and that's usually what they're talking about when they say antebellum. Yeah, that's a good question, because they'll just use that word expecting you to know what it means. Other questions or topics that we should go over?
Like an overview of like how the test is gonna go tomorrow, kind of.
Yeah, so overview of the test. So we have the first section is multiple choice, 55 questions in 55 minutes. This is worth 40% of your grade. If you can't see, let me know. So 55 questions, 55 minutes, 40% of your grade. Then you have three. So they'll do 55 questions and then everybody will be done same time. They'll say, okay, we're done with that. Now let's move on to the 3 short answer questions. Okay. You have 40 minutes for this section. So that works it up to be what? 12-ish minutes per question, just a little over. Okay. And this section is 21% of your overall grade. After that, let's say, okay, we're done with short answer questions now. I believe, and Mr. Keel might be able to correct me, I believe there's a break here for like 5 minutes, but I could be wrong. And then there is 1 DBQ. which is going to be about 25% of your overall grade. And then 2 more short answer questions. And this is 14% of your grade. Now, the reason why I didn't put times there is because this section right here is one big block of time. So I don't think, I'm pretty sure that they won't tell you, okay, you have to move on to your short answer question. Well, they won't say you have to move on. They might tell you, hey, it's been an hour. Think about starting to move on. You get an hour and 40 minutes. For that whole time period. So usually that means for a DBQ, it's somewhere between an hour and maybe an hour and 15 minutes. What you should do when you start the DBQ, notice what time it is and figure out what is an hour and 15 minutes from that time. Because when you get to that point, if you haven't moved on to short answer questions, you should move on. Because by that time, you have, what would that be? 25 minutes left to answer 2 questions. Then you're getting into that same time period that was about here. That's about 12 minutes per question. Go ahead.
I just asked, like, how much is the right?
Yeah, usually, so there's a short answer question. Usually they do like an A, B, and a C, right? For each of those parts, usually you would do like 2 to 4 sentences. If you do less than 2 questions or 2 sentences, you're probably not answering the question fully. 4 sentences, you're getting like, okay, there's a lot here. You should not do more than 4 sentences for each part.
You combine the part, like a whole paragraph would be like really.
What I would do is I would do that. I would write in a line, A, blah, 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 do my answer. And then let's say my answer is right here and it ends there. I would start the next line and write B, blah, 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 blah. Because I don't know, in my opinion, that just looks easier to read for the reader. You want to make it as easy as possible for the reader to know where you're at, right? Like, okay, here they're starting the B, here they're starting the C. Instead of looking for it and being like, okay, maybe that's them trying to say what the answer for B is. But usually it's 2 to 4 sentences for each part. Okay.
The DBQ, we
Yep.
still have to write like.
Yeah, do not write a conclusion sentence or paragraph. And the big reason is, here, I'll write that. If you write a conclusion paragraph, you're taking away time from your short answer question. And the conclusion paragraph really doesn't do anything for you, doesn't add anything. Because most likely you're writing an introduction paragraph with a thesis statement and contextualization up there. So anything you write in the conclusion is just redundant and it's not needed, it doesn't do anything. You're just taking away time that you could be answering the short answer questions. So don't do a conclusion paragraph. It's not going to help you unless you decide not to do an introduction paragraph, which you could. And then you just make a conclusion paragraph, but that's kind of weird, so don't do that. So no conclusion paragraph, DBQ, 2 short answer questions.
Like this.
Yep, so you do a source, you describe it, okay, what's in the document, and then you say how it connects to your thesis statement. You always have to connect it to the thesis statement to get the points, because they'll give you 7 documents. You have to do that with 6 of those documents. Explain how it connects to your thesis statement. That's how you get the full points. So, right, like if there's a document, let's say it's from George Washington, you should introduce it by saying like George Washington says blah blah blah, or George Washington believes, you describe the document that way using the author's name if it has an author. I like whenever I introduce a document at the end of the sentence, doing like parentheses, document A. I think that's easier for the reader. But if you're, talking about the document and introducing it and who it is, you don't necessarily have to do that. But I don't know, when I'm reading DBQs, it's easy for me to look for, okay, here's document A, here's B. Anything to make it as easy as possible for the readers, the better, right? Because those are the people who are reading your documents to give you a score. So you want them to like you, not be like reading your essay and being like, I can't stand whoever wrote this. So you want to make it easy for them. Some questions in the chat. What did Nixon do with Vietnam again? We talked about that here, Vietnamization. So taking US soldiers out and replacing it with South Vietnamese soldiers. And then what was the New South? I'd be surprised if they ask about that. New South is the idea of after the Civil War, bringing in more industrialization during the industrialization period. So as industrialization becomes more mechanized, they don't need as many unskilled labor sharecroppers as they did before. But yeah, New South is not one of the priorities, I guess.
What is something you think won't be really asked on the test?
That won't be asked?
Yeah.
So I guess I'll say stuff like, so stuff that they don't ask very many questions about is pre-1492 and post 1980. Those time periods they don't ask very many questions about. I think it's like 5% or less. So would be less than 5%. So less than 5% of the test will be this time period. So, I wouldn't do too much studying of the Three Sisters farming techniques of pre-1492, or what was Clinton policies. I wouldn't be looking at that tonight. Things they won't look at, they're not going to be asking you battles. They just never do. They never ask about the Civil War. Like Civil War battles or anything. They'll ask causes of the wars, but they'll never ask battles. Other things they won't ask. I mean, they're not going to ask you, they're not going to show you a picture like in the Cahoots today and say, who is this person? Yeah, those are some things I think that we see a lot, seemingly every year. I feel like there's always questions about the Great Awakenings. That's one that always seems to sneak up on people. Questions about the Great Awakenings. I feel like there's always a question about like causes of revolution, or the debates about the Constitution, Federalists versus anti-Federalists. I feel like there's always questions about causes of Civil War, about Reconstruction, progressives, and Vietnam era. I feel like those questions, these topics, are always asked in some way, especially like the short answer questions. You have 5 questions to ask this year. I'd be surprised if they didn't ask questions like this on those. I'm not saying they won't, right? They might throw in a 1950s questions like that. but it just seems like every year there's at least 1 or 2 questions that fall into these categories. So, and they're big ideas, right? Like if you go home tonight and think, okay, what caused the Revolutionary War? What caused the Civil War? You know, that's gonna help you a lot. They're probably not gonna ask you what caused World War II, right? So other things they're not gonna ask you, world history stuff. Really, the only exception is Spanish exploration. If they're going to do world history, it's probably going to be that. They've done that a couple times. Okay, as I'm seeing some questions on the chat. What do we know about the different economic crisis? You know, Lily, I think for economic crisis, really the big one is just going to be the Great Depression. You know, we've talked before about all the different panics of the 1800s. I don't know if I can remember any questions they've ever asked about panics. Maybe asking about things like the bank wars between Jackson and the Bank of the United States. But yeah, the panics of the 1800s, I don't think you really need to worry about those. You could maybe use them as like outside evidence in a DBQ, but that's about it. Could you go over what the home front was like in World War I, World War II, and Cold War? It was a Cold War just with the Red Scare and stuff. Sure. So let's see if I can summarize that quickly. So World War I home front. What you need to think of for home front for World War I, everything is voluntary. So like they had like meatless days and sweetless days, where people would voluntarily give up food and supplies or do gardens to keep inflation down, to help the soldiers at home. Okay, we have things like the Sedition Acts, which prevented people from protesting against the war. When we get to World War II, things are compulsory, they're forced. There's rationing. You don't have a choice whether to ration or not. The government's just going to do it. Okay, so your home front, your life is much more affected in World War II compared to World War I. Because World War I, if you didn't want to volunteer and stuff like that, you probably didn't have to. You might get some social pressure to do it, but you weren't forced. World War II, you are. But still, there is voluntary stuff like buying war bonds. And then for Cold War, you know, we don't have rationing. People aren't giving war bonds, but people are more afraid of things and figuring out what can I do. So people build like bomb shelters, people practice evacuation routes, people practice like duck and cover drills. It's much more, it feels like individualized in the Cold War. You know, is my neighbor a communist? Stuff like that. Will we need to know about all the different panics that happened throughout the years? No, you don't need to know panics. Maybe if you wanted to use one as outside evidence, but that'd be a pretty specific DBQ that would need the answer for that question. I feel like your time is better used somewhere else than knowing the panics. How immigration changed. So big immigration changes, and this is in at least my class. We went over the those like mini timelines in class. One of them was about immigration, so you might be able to check that out of what we did in class. But so we have 1840s and 50s was mostly German and Irish immigration, which leads to things like I lost it. There was a nativist group Know Nothing Party. The Know Nothings were nativist, meaning they were against immigrants. Then fast forward to the 1880s, and we have the Chinese Exclusion Act. Fast forward to the 1920s, and we have quotas that prevents people from South and East Europe from coming into the Americas. And eventually in 1965, the Great Society gets rid of a lot of those quotas. We're going to be done in just a couple of minutes, but the question is, can you quickly go over what eras liked unions and which eras did not? Well, I would say there are people in all different eras who like or dislike unions. Labor unions, like we talked about them a lot in the late 1800s. But during that time period, the government and police are willing to be very violent with protesters or with strikers. They almost always side with the business, not with the strikers. They would increase the number of people in unions in things like World War I, World War II, but labor unions would decrease post World War II. Show it without a glare. Okay, we're gonna be done in just a minute. Any last questions or anything?
Cause of the second Great Awakening.
Cause of the Second Great Awakening. So remember the Great Awakening one cause is the idea of the church is more reflective of what you believe. So churches started splitting. So I always use the example of baptism in Christianity. In the in the Bible story, Jesus says to get baptized, but all these churches have different opinions about how that looks. Do you do it when you're old? Do you do it when you're a baby? Do you dunk people underwater? Do you sprinkle on it? And so churches would split based on their beliefs, including their beliefs on slavery. So sometimes churches would have the same theological beliefs, but they differ on if they're pro or anti-slavery, and so they split off into different denominations. So that's the Second Great Awakening. Okay, how early should we log into the test? 10:30, yep, because the test starts at 11. You're supposed to log in half an hour before. So make sure if you haven't done it yet, you go into the testing system and you complete the test setup so that it downloads the test onto your Chromebook and you're ready to go for tomorrow. No Zoom meeting. Nope. It's all on you. So, okay, that's all I got. You're gonna do great. I will post this later. Make sure you check out any of the other videos that are posted online for help too. So that's all I got.